Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special program at Johnson City Public Library. I'm excited about hearing this. We have some presenters, guests from Sightwork Studios in Asheville, and they have actually worked on some exciting plans for the library for a new landscaping paradigm that we're still in the development stage, but these plans are phenomenal, and these people, they really know their stuff, and they're just here for you tonight. So I'm just going to turn it over to them. I will say, before they get started, just housekeeping. We might all want to check our cell phones and make sure our ringer's off, just so that doesn't disturb the performance. And if anyone needs to use the restroom, that's just in the hall down there. And please join me in giving a hand to our guest, Stephen Lee Johnson, and Rich Pembroke. Amy.
Anyway, thank you all for coming tonight. Amy and I didn't know how many to expect, but I could hear conversations going on in the room before, and I know we've got some pretty intense gardeners here. The information that we're going to share with you tonight is really exciting, and not only because it's some of it's kind of new to us and through research, but there's a huge wave that's occurring in gardens all over America right now. And it's occurring at a really rapid rate, and it's exciting to be a part of that. A lot of it has to do with the creatures that you see right here. But what we're going to talk about this evening are basically not just the beloved honeybee or the other pollinators that are a part of that group, but we're going to talk about some exciting projects that are occurring here in Johnson City that we at Sightwork Studios are really thrilled to be a part of. We're also going to talk about how to create some of these exciting garden spaces, not just meadows, but pollinator gardens in large open areas beside your church, your school, your front yard, if you're like an urban rebel and you've got vegetables in your front yard and that kind of thing. It's really exciting. So that's kind of how we're going to lay out the presentation today. And I'd like to introduce Amy Fahmy, and a little bit about Amy before she comes up. Me and my staff in Asheville are so excited to have Amy as a key member of our staff. Amy is an incredible, phenomenal plants person, much more so than I am. She's our lead horticulturist. She got her master's from NC State in landscape architecture, and she is the queen of pollination, and next to Judy, or Judith here. So, Amy, it's all yours, okay?
All right, welcome all of you, and I think that most of you are either interested in gardening, or you're interested in pollinators, or you're interested in what is happening in Johnson City. And it's very interesting what's happening in Johnson City. And before we talk about the projects, I thought that it would be worth talking a little bit about why pollinators have become such a critical issue, and to the point that the media is really starting to cover it. And so I thought what we would do is kind of do a quick look at some of those critical pollinator issues that are behind the activities that we are talking about that are happening in Johnson City. And then we'll move into a little bit more specific project-related information. So what we hear about in the media is the honeybee and maybe the monarch butterfly. And that seems to be the real focus. And there's good reason for that. But there are so many other pollinators, moths, bats, flies, mammals, and all of those are critical to the existence of the plant world that we rely on. But we'll start with the honeybee because about a third of our food crops rely on the honeybee. And that includes green beans and watermelon and cotton, and just the list is really astonishing. And I think for this reason, we are so dependent on the honeybee, and this collapsed colony problem is pretty significant. And for that reason, they've been in the media. So I wanted to make sure just that everybody knows what the honeybee looks like. And you probably recognize it right away. Note that it has kind of the fuzzy head and the striped abdomen, and the antennas kind of bend forward. This is not a native bee, and a lot of our native bees look a little bit similar. I'm a loud talker. Am I blowing you all out of the room?
That's great.
Thank you. So I just wanted to make sure that you recognize that. So here is what is happening now with pollination and honeybees. This is just an example from California where 80% of the world's almonds are grown, and of the 2.3 million commercial hives in the United States, about half of those go every year out to California to pollinate those almond groves. And they come from North Carolina, they come from Florida, they come from Maine. The bees get packed into these plastic boxes and shipped out there in February, and they have to do their job and then they get shipped back. Without that human intervention, we wouldn't have any almonds. Our native bees are equally important, and you'll know some of these bees: sweat bees, carpenter bees, bumblebees, and you know, it's when you start to really look at them that you realize how different they are from the honeybee, and they are responsible for all of the plants that get pollinated in the beautiful Tennessee mountains. So we can't really do without them either. And just a good example of this is Dutchman's breeches. And I don't know if you all know this plant, but you see the little white flower in the middle there. It's like a pair of old Dutch pantaloons hanging upside down, and that's where the name comes from. And this is one of the native Tennessee spring ephemerals that grows out in the mountains. And without the native bumblebee, these plants would not exist. So the queen bee hibernates for the winter, comes out, gets nectar from this Dutchman's breeches, uses it to feed the larvae in her nest, and then the larvae hatch and the bees go out and pollinate the rest of the wildflowers. So it's a very specific relationship. And so we need to be looking out for our native bees as well. And that's part of what a person can do by developing a habitat garden or a meadow. So when you all are thinking about putting together a meadow to pull pollinators in, there are a myriad of things to think about. And I think hopefully tonight what this will do is give you some ideas that will help you to start the planning process, because it's the planning ahead that is really going to save you a lot of time and effort and money and energy. And so what we're going to do is just kind of look at some of those issues, because you have a choice. You could focus in, for example, on a specialist like the monarch butterfly, and what the monarch does is it gets nectar from all kinds of flowers, but it only lays its eggs on the Asclepias, which is milkweed, which are the two plants that you see there. So even though butterfly bush is a plant that you all probably know, and you see butterflies all over it, butterfly bush is only a nectar source. It's not a host plant. There's not a single butterfly larva that can benefit from the butterfly bush. So that's a very specialist kind of relationship. You take this moth, which is one of our native moths. It only feeds on viburnum, the black-caul viburnum, and birches. That's it. So as you think about what you might pull to your meadow or to your pollinator garden, you could choose, for example, to focus on the zebra swallowtail. If you did that, you'll have to have pawpaw, because that's the only plant that they are symbiotic with. So it doesn't matter anything else you put out there. If you want this butterfly, you have to have the pawpaw. You can see their range there. This is the only plant. Now, if you plant pawpaw in your yard, you need to have two of them, and one needs to be male and the other one's female. And that way you get the fruit, and you can eat the fruit yourself, and that's also a seed source for future pawpaws. So these are interesting things to know about. Then there are plenty of insects that are just generalists. They'll eat anything. They can lay their eggs anywhere. And an example of that is the inchworm that we all know, and the woolly bear caterpillar, which is a ground dweller, and it can only see about a centimeter in front of its face, and so it just bumbles along and it eats everything in its path. And then as you start to learn more about these relationships, it becomes very clear that the birds are so dependent upon this network of pollinators that we're looking at. And the chickadee, I think everybody knows the chickadee, only goes a mile or two from the nest. They have to have 10,000 caterpillars to raise one little nest full of babies. So within a mile radius, that's how many pollinators we need to have. And it's hard to imagine our life without these very familiar insects and birds. So this business of fragmentation, you see, everybody recognizes this kind of subdivision, and of course there are many places in the country that are just covered with these, and Johnson City's not there yet. But when you look at this, you see, okay, there's a lot of green space in there. It's not all bad. The thing of it is, and I feel like I'm telling you all a lot of bad news, but there's really a lot of good news coming here in just a minute. These plants that you see in here in these landscapes are not very high up on the list of nectar and food source for our pollinators. And if you get more interested in this, you might look at The Living Landscape, which is a book by Rick Dark and Doug Ptolemy. And it's full of lists of plants for the southeast, and it shows how many pollinators can do something useful with that plant. And most of these are non-native, but they're the most common plants you find in home landscapes, and they're really not doing anything for our pollinators. So here's Johnson City, and fortunately we have a lot more green space here, but you do have to wonder how many pawpaws there might be in here for a swallowtail butterfly. So I'm going to turn it back to Stephen Lee, because what's very clear now across the country is that we need to connect these fragmented habitats, and that's kind of what's happening in Johnson City.
I wanted to show you one thing right quick. This image right here that Amy was showing, as landscape architects, one thing we do too is we plan and design. We're used to images like this, subdivisions and on a large scale. We no longer design in this way, and this is a really exciting part of how development, side of sustainable design is moving forward in the whole industry. But I just wanted to share that with you. So here we are in Johnson City tonight. We've got several exciting projects that are just kind of simultaneously taking place here, thanks to groups like Johnson City Public Library, East Tennessee State University, and the Public Outreach Division. We're being allowed to re-energize portions of the city by beginning these pollinator concepts and ideals. You have the shared library there at ETSU, some initial planning that's going to be taking place to pull together some exciting ideas that will tie in together with the pollinator pathway, which is there's portions of a greenway system along that roadway there that have tremendous potential. And then the beautiful new Founders Park, which you all should be so proud of. We've done some exciting stuff over there, but here at the library, one of the things we've been doing recently is exploring opportunities for the existing landscape, and we're going to share some items with that shortly. But when we zoom just a little bit further out, you can see there's ETSU, there's the public library, and then also some work that we're going to be starting up very shortly at the Natural History Museum. So we've got this triangle of impact that we're beginning to work on, and hopefully all of you live between the public library and the Natural History Museum. So there's going to be like this connected pollinator pathway going through the Johnson City countryside. So at ETSU, this space that we're collaborating with both the campus and the public outreach division is a new garden that's going to just celebrate great gardens, great public campus space, but also beautiful pollinator plants. And that's going to be a really exciting undertaking. Now, this is a little sketch we did actually a couple of years ago. We were working with Tupelo Honey because they were beginning to kind of try to figure out what in the world they were doing, and that's back when the train depot was in major distress. And this pollinator pathway idea was already in place. And like like Tupelo honey, their whole theme is the honeybee. And they just, I guess it's what pulled them into Johnson City, part of it. And then across from that is Founders Park, and ideas, not just plants, but concepts of gardens, of pollinators, of just all the wonderfulness that goes with that. And we designed this new archway that is part of your public art system that's rapidly emerging here. And then this really cool, have any of you seen this?
No.
The human sundial is something we designed, and great artists came in and did this, but it all kind of evokes this same sense of purpose. And hopefully next spring, around all this, is a pollinator garden that we designed that the city's going to be installing. That's all about butterflies and all the other pollinators. But here at the library, just quickly, you can see part of the study that we've been doing for Bob and his board and local citizens, but in addition to public art placement and setting good opportunities for that, landscape enhancements and focusing on long-term sustainable landscape enhancements. This is all about giving you ideas for really creative, long-standing, sustainable concepts that you can take home. And what better place to do that than a really beautiful public facility. And we've had so much great support behind this, but what we've come up with are a couple of just key areas here that are going to be so readily, they're going to be receptive to some exciting concepts that we're going to hopefully be able to help implement in the near future. And if Judith's funding goes its way, it sounds like a part of it may actually happen a lot sooner than later. So that's very exciting. It's actually part of a pollinator meadow in front of Bob's library here, so it better look great. And we're really excited about that. But a specific case study of what's happening right here, and can be fairly typical in your own garden, but how many of you have seen the little amphitheater that's back here in the back of the building? Has anybody not seen this before? Okay, there's a crazy, fabulous space in the back of this building. The landscape that's back there is pretty standard. And so one of the concepts that we developed as part of the study that we've been doing is taking that space and turning it into this just incredibly engaging, educational, sustainable, pollinator-themed garden for children and adults. A multifunctional space, multi-purpose space, but developing habitat not only for bees, but also to make it a little bit more accommodating for people enjoying the space with the shade sails, new containers, and all kinds of exciting stuff. Water's a key component for pollinators, and we're looking at ideas for that water wall back in there. There's kind of a section we developed for that. But this is kind of a plan view of some of the ideas that have been developed for that. And just really exciting combinations of plants that bring in not only new wildlife, pollinators into the heart of Johnson City, but also it's just a great educational tool for children that are here at programs and for adults also. So, what we're going to do now, Amy's going to talk to you about the difference between gardens versus meadows and what are some good ways for implementing both of them and how they can kind of function in your own particular situation.
Okay, so looking at these two images, there's really no difference in terms of how attractive they can be to pollinators, but there's a really big difference in how you maintain them and how they function. And so I just wanted to point out that a meadow situation typically allows you to grow many more of the less beautiful plants because they get mixed into the mix. They kind of get hidden. So if they have ugly foliage, they're sort of hidden, but the flowers are still there. So you can pull in those plants that the pollinators really love, but that might tend to have mold problems or might not be very pretty in form after they bloom and are finished, or they might bloom just for a short time. So there's a lot of flexibility in a meadow. The other thing is that it allows you to grow plants that just seed like crazy, because if you have a pretty flower garden, you don't want these aggressive seeders that will just take over. So if you have a very small space and you want to attract pollinators, what you can do is think more about a garden as opposed to a meadow, where you're working with, instead of seeding things out that will all be commingling, you're looking at those plants that tend to cluster better, that aren't really aggressive seeders, and that are more easily managed, but can still be extremely inviting to pollinators. And this is just an example of wonderful plants that are much more behaved, tend to be typical garden-style plants. They'll never run away on you, but they're all plants that pollinators absolutely love. So I just want to make clear that you don't have to have a huge meadow to bring the pollinators in. You can do it in a very garden-esque kind of style. But meadows are fabulous. They give you a lot of flexibility in what kind of pollinators you can pull in. And so what I thought we would do is just kind of run through how you do it. You've got to find your site. You have to choose the plants. You've got to figure out how much it's going to cost. You need to know how you're going to put it together and then maintain it. So we'll look at those. And the idea is just to kind of give you the broad strokes so that you start to realize what you need to think about. So this is a wonderful meadow setting. And if any of you have a large acreage that you're thinking you want to stop mowing and you want to turn it over to meadow, we have all kinds of ideas that we can help you with about how to make that an efficient and effective process. It's a wonderful way to do a meadow because you can use a tractor to mow it, which is an easy maintenance tool. And large meadows like this are so beautiful from a distance. You don't see all the little bits of bare ground and gaps in between when you look at them from a distance. And those gaps are wonderful for some of the ground nesting bees. What is often the case in our more suburban and urban areas is that we're working with smaller plots. It might be public landscapes. It might be a very urban situation like this. And the trick to these is to really think ahead about what it is going to take from all angles to make this work. So here you have a full sun situation, no irrigation, in the middle of a road where it can't easily be maintained. It's right in the public eye, so it needs to look good. Thinking about what it's going to look like in the winter, how it's going to be maintained. All of those are things that go into the initial planning so that you're not planting plants that just flop right out into the middle of the road, for example. A lot of times we find that niches that folks have available to put their meadows in are shady, and one of the things that happens when you plant a lot of these really popular pollinator plants is that they tend to be more sun-loving, and then you get less bloom, and they tend to reach for the sun and stretch out and flop over. So realizing what kind of a site you have is all about plant choice adaptation to that site. Steep slopes are often available. They're difficult to do anything else with. You want to cover them with something, and a meadow can be very effective on a steep slope. A lot of times, if it's not a big area, obviously you can't mow it. You'll have to string trim it. You get really big plants, tall plants on a steep slope, and they'll just flop right down on the slope. So, you know, another issue here is if you seed it in the late fall, the winter rains can erode all the seed down to the bottom of the hill, and then you've got a meadow just in the strip at the bottom. So it's a tricky thing here as well. So each site that you might choose for your meadow is going to have very specific parameters that you need to think about. Here's another thing to consider. It takes about 3 years to have a really beautiful, stabilized, reliable, fabulous meadow. And in that time period in between, you're kind of working on a very specific schedule towards your goal. So if you're good with having that right at your front door, then that's fine as long as you know what you're up for. But the first year is not going to be the most beautiful year. The second year will be better. The third year will probably be wonderful. There are a lot of things to consider. If your area is too small and you try to seed a meadow in, it may just look like a big weed mass. If it's too small, you may find that your aggressive plants just take over too quickly, and it's just difficult to manage. And so then, of course, you're thinking about, well, which are the right plants for a much smaller setting? Considering how it will look all through the years, how is it going to be viewed? Can you walk all the way around it? Is it just from one side? So these are all things that you want to think about as you start to put your plan together. And then besides how it's going to look, there are questions about how it will grow and how you'll take care of it. And so we're going to look just at those very practical things. A really nice technique I'll just point out here in the middle. When you have a piece of lawn that can give a very manicured look to the perimeter of a meadow, it's a good way to communicate to whoever else might be looking that this is actually a carefully managed site. This is not just a weed leftover, lot. This is actually something that's being cared for and there's a purpose for it. So if you can give it a manicured edge, you'll go a long way in those first 3 years as you work your way to this beautiful setting. Budget. It's more work than you think to get one of these off the ground. And it's not that you can't do it yourself, it's just that sometimes it's really good to have help, and it depends, of course, on the setting that you're trying to do this. And so just thinking from beginning to end, how you get the stuff out that's existing in this landscape, that's a consideration, a lot of back-breaking effort. How you get everything in, how you do your soil amendments, who's going to help you maintain it, can you do all of this yourself? So I'm not trying to say don't do a meadow, I'm just pointing out all of the things that you're going to wish you had thought of later. Okay, so plants are obviously a really important part of this. And so I'm going to just give you 4 great, easy things to think about as you make your selections. The first one is to use local natives. The research shows that insects prefer the native plants. And so if you can go local, that's great. And often you'll see in these seed lists, it'll list great pollinator is bee balm, and it'll say any species within that genus. But you see those 2 bee balms there look very different from each other, and they require different growing environments. The red one here wants really wet soil. So being sure of what you're getting is important. If you look at this plant here, they're both called crown spirit. They're both called verbicina, but one is a really aggressive and weedy western native that's just completely not going to do anything good for us here. So knowing that Verbicina virginiana is local to Tennessee and is available to all the pollinators here is a really useful distinction to make. When you're looking at colors, bees in particular have 4 favorite colors, and they are white and yellow and blue and purple and not red. And so here you have 2 Rudbecula hirtus. You have the yellow one and the red one. And the red one is one of these crazy new cultivars, and it's a huge flower. The bees are not going to love this one because it's not in their color group. And also the flower has been changed so much that they may not even really understand how to access the nectar in this flower. So definitely choosing colors. Sometimes it doesn't matter so much. This is an agastache that's partly native, partly Asian. But the bees don't seem to have any trouble accessing it. It's got part of the native in the genetic makeup. So some of those are perfectly fine. And the more research you do, the more you learn. Flower shapes. Turns out that our native bees are really geniuses. And what they can do is access all of the flower shapes out there. Whereas the honeybees are pretty smart, we know that. But they can't quite figure it out. So what they do is they separate out the workers into different groups that learn how to access the different flowers. So some of them learn how to go to a ray flower, like that blanket flower, the bright yellow and orange one, and some of them learn how to go to the penstemon. And they kind of divvy up the task. But our native bees can do them all, which is, I think, very impressive. And then the 4th way to think about choosing your pollinator plants is just to make sure that you have something through all of the seasons, so that those pollinators can get the nectar energy that they need, and that the plants are there for them to lay eggs at the right time. So making sure that it's not just one part of the season makes a big difference. And then there are grasses, and grasses are a tremendous addition to a meadow. And part of the reason for that is because they look great in the winter when all of the other plants tend to be perennial and die back to the ground, if you can mix grasses into your meadow looks meadow-like for the whole winter. And there are also lots of insects that love our native grasses. So you're still introducing pollinator plants. And the information is out there about which ones to choose and what's good for Tennessee. The one thing you would need to know is that the time to put grasses out in your meadow is not in the fall, it's in the spring. They do not germinate well in the fall, and even if you plant plants in the fall, they tend not to do as well than if you plant them in spring. So what happens is they just go very dormant in the winter, and they don't put out any growth, whereas most perennials grow a little bit and put out roots all through the winter. So you end up often having just dead grasses if you plant them in the fall.
And you have a quick question.
Yeah.
Are those grasses, do they typically go out as plugs or seed, the ornamental grasses, or both?
There are two different ways that you can do that. I think seeding is a really good way to go, but if you want an instant look and you want to kind of get your meadow stabilized and prevent erosion, you can plant plugs, which are just small living plants, so you don't have to wait for the seed to come up, and you can get kind of an instant meadow look that way. The wonderful benefit about the seeding is that you can get a really uniform distribution, and some of them come up quite early, and so you start to get this whole mass of green early in the spring. And that depends a lot on which type of grass seed you choose, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Just want to throw in there that not all meadows are the same height, and I well remember this meadow outside of Asheville, and you see it here in this picture at the top right. It looks like it's about 6 or 8 inches tall. Beautiful meadow. You could meander through it with your dog. And then at the end of the summer, right next to it, I don't know if you can see it, but the meadow is over your head, and it's like you're walking through this amazing jungle. And that's great if that's what you planned on, but if you thought that it was going to be at knee height, you're in for a big shock. And it's a wonderful experience to go through a meadow that's over your head, and the bees are loving it, and the birds are in there. But if that's what everybody was threading their way through to your front door, you just got to decide if that's your thing or not, so I'm throwing that out there. Okay, so this is the crux of the how-to part is the weed seed challenge. And if you're a gardener, you probably recognize some of these weeds at the bottom. I don't know if you can see them, but they're all a nightmare, every single one of them. And you don't want any of those. And there are seeds of all of those in the seed bank in the soil. So our soils are full of weed seeds, and we've got to get them out. If you have a large area, basically what you're doing is you're tilling it up, and that brings to the surface weed seeds. And they germinate, and then you have a field full of weeds. And then you till those up, and they get uprooted and they die. So you've knocked out that level. But you've tilled up another layer, and those come up. And then you very carefully till the surface, and you just knock back those weeds, but you don't dig down to the next layer of seed bank. And from that level, you go on and you do your whole meadow, and you mow every year, and we'll talk more about that. But being able to use a tractor in this kind of tilling method is entirely different from what you'll do on a smaller scale. And we love to help folks with meadows of this size. They're absolutely rewarding, and if you are involved with space that requires maintenance crews or lots of regular mowing, and you've just had it and you want to turn to meadow, that's a very doable thing. So let's look at what is probably a more urban, fragmented kind of habitat that you're trying to fit into somewhere like within the city limits where there's not a great big acreage. So we're just going to zip through these so that you can see how to do this. I would suggest that you start in the summer, and somehow you're going to have to get rid of your existing stuff that's out there, the weeds that are there. If you cannot bring yourself to use herbicides, then you've got about a year of covering this with plastic to suppress the weeds and block the sun. And that works, but you've got to start a year ahead. So you're going to start, you're going to spray everything out. Once it's dead, you're going to till it. You're going to rake out all the weeds and clods and everything and get it nicely smoothed out. You're going to put some compost over it, just to kind of hold it in case it rains and make it look nice. And then you're going to wait and the weeds will come up. And when they're about 6 inches high, you're going to spray it again. And once they're dead, you're going to till it again and rake it smooth. So what you've done is you've promoted weed growth twice, and you've knocked out that seed bank so that you really have a pretty clean slate that you're starting from. And definitely only till when the soil is dry, otherwise you get this hard pan on the surface that is nasty to work with. So then you have a choice. You can either, so by this time you've gone through all that, it's probably fall and you're looking at winter coming on and you're trying to decide, should I go ahead and throw out my seed or plant my plants now, or should I wait until the spring? So the benefits we'll talk about in just a minute. But in any case, if you do sow right away, you're going to want to cover it for the winter. If you don't sow, you'll still cover it with a light layer of pine straw so that just for all the winter rains and the time that you're waiting, it stabilizes the site and kind of holds it in this waiting period. Spring comes, you're going to pull off your pine straw and you're going to plant either your plants, you're going to seed, you may put in your grasses, you're going to water everything in, and you're going to wait for it to grow. And I will say that you'll need to kind of pressure soil down after all that tilling, and you can either roll it, which is something you could probably rent from somebody that does landscape equipment rentals, or you can just step all over it, step, 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 get your friends out there, just press it down so that once the seed is on there, you get good seed contact. It's not quite so fluffy. And then after that, you start into trimming mode, and the real key there, and we'll get into this a little more, is not to go too short, or you start cutting off too much of the leaves of your perennials that are coming up. So we'll talk a little bit more about why you do that. So, which is better to use, seeds or plugs? I think that plugs are really nice when you want to have a little bit more of a cluster look, I guess is what I'm trying to think. When you just seed out randomly, you get this wild random mix. If you want to have a big cluster of purple and then a big cluster of yellow, plugs make it really easy to kind of separate that out, maybe give it a more aesthetic look, a little more organized look, and plugs allow you to have that kind of a control. Seeding is nice because it just gives you that complete intermingling, and it's very easy to throw all of that out, so it's a much easier thing to do. And you can see these seed sources are wonderful, and they have websites at Ernst Conservation Seed and Prairie Moon Nursery. You can learn a whole lot from them about how to do a meadow. I will say that when you sow in the fall, you want to do it after a hard frost. If you do it too soon, the plants can germinate, and then that frost will kill them right away. And so you've got to wait until after a hard frost, and then when you seed, the seeds just sit there for the winter, and the cold helps to break up the seed coat, and then they'll come up in the spring. So that's a very important distinction if you're going to do it in the winter. The good thing about doing it in the winter is that then as soon as the soil starts to warm up, the seeds can start to come up. So it's a little, you can get a little bit of an early jump on the process by putting them out in the winter. If you throw them out in the spring, the good thing is, especially on a slope, you won't have had all that winter rain and the erosion, so you'll know that after you throw them out, the seed's pretty well going to be where you put it, and it's going to come right up. That's a benefit. You don't want to wait too late. Definitely you want to do this in March. If you wait until May to do this, the heat will be too hot on these little tiny seedlings, and they just can't take it. Even if you water it every day, it's very difficult to move into that heat. So they really need that long spring period to grow in. Okay, so then we're to the maintenance. So your meadow is in and it's come up and it's looking great. What you're doing now is trying to keep the weeds from taking over. And the whole principle here is you're just going to whack off the tops of those weeds before they can set seed. And it doesn't matter if you whack off the tops of the perennials, because what they've got is this good rooted structure with lots of leaves, and so it might not be as beautiful flowering, but the plants, the perennial plants, are going to just keep on going. and you've knocked out the competition from the weeds, because most weeds are annual, so they're just going to grow and set seed, and then you've got this whole new seed bank that you spent all that time getting rid of. So you want to mow or trim before you see any weeds setting seed. That's pretty critical. So if you have a big meadow, you can do it with a mower, a tractor mower. If you have a small meadow, you're going to have to do it with a string trimmer. And a lawnmower won't work because it cuts too short. You'll cut into your perennials and you'll kill all of your perennials that are in there. So you'll lose your wildflower base.
What
yeah.
is too short?
Anything below 4 inches. So 4 inches is cutting it close. So far better to stay around 8 or 12 inches even. And so that's what you're going to do. And anytime your weeds start to get about 12 to 18 inches, you're going to go in there and you're going to weed eat them down again. So the first year of your meadow, you're going to be cutting off flowers, which is hard to make yourself do, but the payoff is absolutely there. So you have to just discipline yourself to chop all those beautiful flowers down. And so then you move into the winter, and you just kind of trim it, get your meadow looking neat, so it's just not a huge mess for the winter. You'll be able to leave it up later when you've got all these great dried seed heads, and that's for the future. But what you want to do for the first winter is kind of trim it down and rake it and clean it up a little bit. And then when the meadow comes up in the summer, you start the same thing again. You start your trimming process. Anytime you see weed seed heads forming, get out there and string trim your meadow. And you'll probably have to do it at least twice over a summer. If you find that you've got nasty weeds coming in and they're just taking over, you can get a glove with herbicide on it and go into your meadow and spot treat those. So if there's a really aggressive weed and it's just getting ahead of you and you can tell it's taking over, that's a way to do that. And sometimes tree saplings, sometimes if you have honeysuckle or kudzu, that would be the kind of thing you just want to just get it out of there. And then look where you are now. That's where you're going, and isn't that fabulous? And so you've done 2 years of kind of slaving along, and then suddenly you're here. And so your goal now is to watch the meadow and see how the balance is coming along. Are there some plants that are just taking over? Is it turned into a sea of goldenrod? Do you need to overseed and fill in some gaps where it's just not exactly where you wanted it? Was there something that never came up and now you're not going to get the butterfly you were planning on? Can you maybe add some plugs? So the third year is your evaluation year, and you're still watching the weeds, and if you need to, you can string trim it again. But at this point, if you've done all of that, you're quite close to not having such a laborious task. So it's really the third year that your meadow will start to shine. And so there are lots of ways in that third year that you can watch and evaluate. Maybe your grasses were hugely successful. You can seed in annuals, which will give you immediate color for that summer, and annuals are very long blooming, and there are a lot of pollinators that have very friendly relationships with annuals. And you can pick plants and things that you're particularly interested in, like this rattlesnake master. I saw it at the Arboretum in Asheville, and the honeybees were all over it. And just tucking a few of those into gaps in your meadows would make it a much more interesting meadow. So there are all kinds of options out there. You'll begin to learn about and see those as you move forward with this fantastic meadow. So we'll wrap it up with that, but I think it gives you an idea about what we're trying to take on at the library. You can come over and use this as your test study case as you watch the 2 years of transition and then what happens in the third year. And I hope this has inspired you a little bit to do your own meadow and to support these great projects that are going on in Johnson City. So thank you.
One question though about if all the dirt in the meadow area is removed because it is compacted, then ties into that project we're talking about. If you took it all out and then you replaced it with native soil, would you still be on the same 3-year cycle, or would you be on more of a 2-year cycle?
If you are importing a soil mix, that, for example, it might be compost and a topsoil mixed together, which would be a really ideal soil to bring in. As long as you have a certified weed-free mix that you're bringing in, which many of them are, you can put aside a good bit of all of that mowing and trimming. Some seeds will come in because the birds will drop them or they'll get blown in, but you won't have the same kind of seed bank issue. So that's a way to just kind of cheat and skip ahead, and if you can do that, it's a really wonderful way to speed up the process. And I think that's what we're looking towards at the library. So you may not see as much of the string trimming and all of that. Yeah.
Well, that brings me to my question. If we do a meadow in the front lawn, which is the largest space that we have here on the campus of the library, once it's fully developed, can you just give me a quick sketch of the maintenance cycle? I mean, once it's mature and we have it established, what do we have to do to maintain it?
I think you'll really only need to mow it once a year, or string trim it once a year. Yours will be a string trimmer meadow. And once it's fully established, you'll have to keep an eye out for aggressive weeds that might get in there and take over, and that might be, might have to get out there now and again and take the glove with some Roundup on it and knock something out. Like walnut tree saplings sometimes will just show up out of nowhere and start coming up. But for the most part, you should be able to do a once a year string trim, and that's it. Then that's it. And you may consider overseeding occasionally just to kind of keep the meadow going.
And he would be string trimming into the height of about a foot?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
But it would also have probably be anchored with some of the grasses to give it some interest year-round. So,
right. So what we're hoping to do is here at the library is a really good mix of grasses and perennials, so that this is a meadow that can stay up through the winter. So that you'll have these grasses, and then you'll have seed pods of something like echinacea, or maybe the pods from baptisia. And so through the winter, it's going to look like a meadow. Now, if it turns out that you all just don't like the wildness of the meadow for the winter, then it can be trimmed late fall, and then it just kind of looks like a big mulch bed in the middle of a lawn for the winter.
So with grasses.
Yeah,
Grasses can stay up.
I think probably we would ideally either take it all down, or it would be a meadow look. And I think we'll have enough grasses in this mix that it's going to look like kind of a winter grassy meadow. We're going to work really carefully to get that winter structure in there. And then the time that you would trim it is in the spring. So that's when you want to knock out all the dead foliage and get it all cleaned up, so that when everything fresh comes up, it's not mixed in with a lot of dead stuff. Do you have a question?
Yes, I live on a main thoroughfare near down, just a walk over, and I'd like to do this in my front yard, and I just wondered if anyone is aware of issues with the city, as far as growing this kind of thing, not in the backyard, but the front yard.
Has anyone...
The high visibility that it will have during the first couple, 3 years when I'm trying to get it established is, I think, if I can just prove that it can be done and done beautifully, I'll be okay after that, but I'm worried about starting it and then the city come along and say, you have to cut your grass.
Yeah, I have a good kind of a case study that we ran into before. This was in the city of Birmingham, when code basically requires you to take care of your property, and if you don't, then you get a notice violation, and then they're going to come through and they're going to do it and then bill you for it. I think that what's key with these meadows is that of course, there are portions of your garden that are going to have a maintained look, and I think that edge that Amy was talking about is a great example of how maybe there's a perimeter around your meadow that is maintained. And even if it's like a 6 or 10 foot wide grass strip, that's what we're suggesting out here in front of the library, because this has to look good. And if you had like a maintained edge, I think that would help kind of alleviate some issues on that, and give the lot the appearance that it is being maintained. So that might be a good thing to think about, rather than have the meadow go all the way to like the sidewalk. You might get into some local code issues with it, possibly. So, just a thought.
any other questions then, thank you all for coming.
When is this going to start here at the library? When can we start seeing stuff happen? Do you know yet?
We don't quite know yet. At the moment, we're pursuing a grant which may enable us to start on it pretty soon, but we're not sure about that yet. But hopefully soon. Maybe next season, after the winter, we might be ready to get started.
And one more thing, can you tell me, is the city aware of this plan?
Yes.
And
Yes.
they're good with it?
They're good with it.
Good. So I can say, is this property owned by the city that the library sits on? Is this owned by the city? Or the building? I don't understand the relationship with the city.
It is complicated. The library, the city does own the building and the property really. We manage the library, but they're completely on board. And that is part of the idea, is for the library to be a community showpiece, an educational showpiece, to kind of illustrate how this can be done. That's what we're hoping to do.
As part of the project, there's definitely an informative process. There's a kiosk that will help citizens understand kind of the process. But I'm going to point to this picture right here. This is a really good example. This is the suggested project area here, but the proposal calls for this nice big band of green manicured turf all around the public right-of-way to remain. So when you drive past the library, what you will see is a manicured turf edge and then the meadow. And so that's really a key component to make it. If we brought the meadow all the way down to this wall, Bob would have some really tough days at work. With the newspaper and the radio station.
Let's just put a sign up that says we meant to do that.
Yeah.
And there's not a problem in the city's mind at this point with the very fact that it is to attract bees. I'm just curious about the whole bee relations or
And your attention, please. The library will be closing in 30 minutes. If you need to make ride arrangements, please do so at this time. We also request anyone who needs to apply for a library card come to the circulation desk now.
I wish we could turn that on.
I think an important aspect of it is, we mentioned bees, but it's about pollinators.
yes.
And, the moths, the butterflies, all the other creatures that take part in this. So that's a key.
So, for example, at the back of the library where all the kids are, we have a small section where the bees are invited, but it's not right around the amphitheater. We're focusing more on the butterflies there. And if you're right on a sidewalk where lots of people come back and forth, you might just consider putting your bee-loving plants towards the area away from the sidewalk and do more other pollinator plants towards the front or something, like that.
Okay. I think it's wonderful. I'm excited.
Where do meadows exist in the natural environment? Is that like a post-fire kind of like a full sun meadow?
Yeah, the prairies of the Midwest, which are kind of disappearing now, are natural native prairies that existed for thousands of miles. And many of the species that are also native here in Tennessee are native out there in those meadows. And, these kinds of plants. There's also, here in Tennessee, sunny outcrops, places where trees have come down. Rocky areas that are open and don't grow trees can have meadow situations. So there are lots of native existing meadows.
And also, fire is what creates a lot, especially where the longleaf pine forests, like in Georgia, South Carolina, southern lowlands. But fire is a friend of large meadows, and in really large ones is how it's maintained. They burn them off, and that can get a little controversial too at times.
Yeah, but a controlled burn is a wonderful way to add nutrients to the soil and rejuvenate your landscape and knock out all those weed seeds and trees that are coming up and that kind of thing. All right. Thank you all very much.
That was a
Tractor work, I'd say.
Yeah.
There's some tractor work there. Tractors are great.
Yeah, I've got access. better than mowing all